Chapter 22 is on gas exchange. Okay, don't write all this down. This is just an example. All right, when you talk about surviving in thin air, like up in the Himalayas, obviously there's less oxygen up there. So the human body is not normally evolved for that situation, and so climbers can do things to help increase their oxygen uptake, but certainly if they just climb up there, they can die from lack of oxygen. It is so low that if you were to go up there, if I could transport you up there without having time to adjust, you would just pass out. So very low oxygen up in the high levels of the Himalayas. Okay. Um, and while we can't just go up there, geese can. They can fly right over the Himalayas. And so how do they do that? Well, they have certain adaptations that allow them to do that. They have very efficient lungs, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, but they have no dead space in their lungs. They exhale all of the air and inhale all of their air back in. When we exhale, we always have a little bit of air left in our lungs. They have very special hemoglobin that has a very high affinity for oxygen. So whatever oxygen is there, it can grab a hold of it and transport it to their tissues. When we talk about gas exchange, we're just calling it respiration. A little different than cellular respiration. We're talking about an organism here. But as you know, they're connected because ultimately the oxygen we're talking about is going to end up in the cells of our bodies. All right, so here's your overview. Gas exchange involves breathing. We breathe the oxygen in. We transport that oxygen to our cells. The oxygen is taken in by the cell. The cell has cellular waste byproduct, CO2, that is given off by the cell. It goes in reverse. It's transported to our lungs, and we exhale the CO2. So your basic gas exchange provides oxygen for cellular respiration and removes the waste, CO2. Animals exchange O2 and CO2 across a moist body surface, and it has to be moist for that plasma membrane to work correctly because we're going to take this into our cells. It's going to go across a plasma membrane. It can't be a dry surface. So if you're looking at your lungs, they're moist. If you're looking at the outside of a worm, it is moist. It also has to be thin because we're letting O2 diffuse across it and CO2 diffuse out of it. So you want a thin, moist area. All right, some animals, like the earthworm, use their entire skin as a gas exchange organ. And so, again, they're going to be moist, though, because you have to have moisture for the membranes to work correctly. And you can see the capillaries come right here, right up against the skin. And so you bring, this is blood containing high levels of CO2, and then that can be released or respiration out, and then it's going to take O2, oxygen in, and the red capillary is going to be an area of high oxygen. Okay. For most animals, we have specialized body parts to provide a large enough surface area for gas exchange. Worms could not be as big as we are. You don't have the surface area. So the way animals will do it is we'll take things and we'll fold them back and forth to increase surface area. If you look at a fish's gills over here, for the fish gills, you can see there's a bunch of little folds. Look here, and they go back and forth. And in each one of these little folds, you have the capillary come right up against the surface where it can give off the CO2 and uptake the O2. And all that folding increases surface area. The same for a insect. They actually have the respiratory system, these little tubes, trachea, go throughout their body. And they have these little pores that will take O2 in and release CO2 out. And that's throughout the whole body. And then you have mammals. This is the same as our lungs. You have, again, you can see all the little sacs here increase the surface area. Gills are adapted for gas exchange in aquatic environments. So they do this in wet environments. They're extensions of the body, and they absorb O2, in the dissolved oxygen in the water. And they have to be pretty good at grabbing oxygen because I'm sure you can imagine there's less oxygen available in water to be grabbed than there is in the air. Okay, so in a fish, the gas exchange um, is exchanged by ventilation and countercurrent flow of water and blood. So let's look at the first one, ventilation. Ventilation means we need a lot of water going across our gills to pull out the oxygen. There's not a lot of oxygen in water, so we're going to use large volumes of water to do this. And here you can see the water is being pulled through the fish's mouth, and then it goes across the gills. So that gives us a large amount of water. And then if we look at the way the gills work, it's a countercurrent flow. And countercurrent flows you're going to see used fairly often in biology, so you need to get used to them. It's the idea, and you can see it over here, that you have one thing flowing, in this case water, one direction. The water's going this way. And what the body will do is a trick. It will do something else flowing against that flow. And in this case down here, it's going to be blood. And you can see the blood is flowing from left to right. And the reason we do this is that if you look at the water as it goes from left to right here, it's highest in oxygen before it hits the gills. And it's lowest in oxygen as it's just about to come out of the fish and out into the water. So the way the countercurrent flow works is that the fish takes the blood, and here are these capillaries spread it out to give it maximum surface area. It takes the blood that has the least amount of oxygen in it and puts it where the water has the least amount of oxygen in it. And then it pumps it this way so that it gets to increasing areas of oxygen to the point where over here the blood finally reaches the part where there's the most oxygen. And what this does is it really increases the efficiency of getting oxygen out of the water and into the blood. The trachea system of insects, those are all those little pores and then the little tubes you saw in the insects, provides direct exchange between the air and the body cells. So these actually go to pretty much every cell in an insect. And then land animals, obviously we're not worried about water anymore. We are breathing air. Okay, so here's your trachea system in an insect. You can see it in the body, and it transports oxygen to all the cells. So first look at the body here. Let's take a look at the body right here. You can see all these trachea, these tubes. Then if you look down, right, each one branches out and gets smaller and smaller so that it literally bumps up against each and every cell. So each cell gets a supply of oxygen. Terrestrial vertebrates, or a vertebrate, have lungs. And in mammals, air is inhaled through the nostril, passes the pharynx, the larynx, and then the trachea, the bronchi, and the bronchioles. If you go all the way down into the lungs, certainly you can breathe through the mouth, but normally you breathe through the nose. And actually, it's better to breathe through your nose. You have hairs that filter and actually clean the air before it goes into your lungs, which is oddly a good thing. Okay, here you go. Your bronchioles, you have these little clusters. These kind of look like grapes to me. And here you have these little sacs at the end. Here you go. And you can see, let's get that, there we go. You can see you have the oxygen pore blood come down, and then you get maximum surface area. You have the air in here. Again, it's going to be a moist membrane. And then the oxygen will diffuse across that membrane, and you have the oxygen-rich blood coming back up. All right, so smoking, obviously really, 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 really bad on the respiratory system. You assault it pretty much in every way. It causes inflammation. It causes mucus. Everything that protects your lungs, all these systems that protect sort of that very tender membrane down there, the plasma membrane and all that moisture, you dump chemicals on that. And actually, our lungs are pretty efficient at pulling things out of the air. Not only smoking, but there's chemicals in the air that end up in our lungs. And unfortunately, our lungs, because they are so directly tied to our blood supply, can get chemicals right into your body, even faster than through your skin, or even if you were to eat something. Here you go. Lovely picture of a healthy lung on the left and a really not so healthy lung on the right. And you can see the carbon from the smoking has left black junk everywhere. So you can pretty clearly see what it does there. Also on the one on the right, that person also had lung cancer from smoking. Okay, breathing ventilates the lungs. So when we looked at the fish, they open their mouth and the water passed through the gills. We breathe to get the most oxygen past our capillaries. And the way we breathe, we can do, there's two things involved. Our rib cage can expand and our diaphragm goes up and down. And when they talk about negative pressure breathing, that means that you pull your diaphragm down and it creates like an empty space in your lungs, and the air has to rush in to fill that space. So you can see right here, if your diaphragm gets pulled down, it's being pulled down here, you're going to inhale air. And so it's been pulled down here and your rib cage has expanded out. To exhale the air, the diaphragm pushes up and your rib cage pulls in. Vital capacity is the maximum volume of air we can inhale and exhale, but our lungs still hold a little residual volume, and so that's not completely efficient. We're not exhaling everything. Right? Birds, on the other hand, have all the air flows one direction. It actually will completely flow through their lungs in a single direction, so they end up with completely emptying their lungs, and it's actually a more efficient way of doing that. So let's see if I can get this to follow it. We're going to inhale. These sacs act like little billows, all right, so that we're going to inhale. This is just a holding sac. Here are the lungs. You can see the lungs here. They're tubes, and the air goes one direction through them. So this little image is this over here. We push the air through here, and then come over to here, jump over to here. So we push the air through, and then we exhale it out. So that in this little lung area, all the air goes one direction. It goes from the bottom up. Okay, breathing is automatically controlled, and obviously that's an evolutionary adaptation. You have to be able to sleep and still breathe. It can be manually controlled. I can make you do it just by saying, haha, you are now manually breathing, and you will start to manually breathe and think about it, but that would be mean, so I won't do it. So you will do it automatically unless you think about it. Now, how does that work? How does your body know when it needs to breathe? If you have a stubborn child who holds their breath until they pass out, what tells the body that it needs to take a breath? And the answer is it's the pons and the medulla in your brain actually regulate this. And there is a sensor in your aorta right here that senses the CO2 level. And so if CO2 rises, which is what the sensor senses. It actually doesn't sense a drop in O2. It senses a rise in CO2. It will tell the pons and the medulla, hey, start breathing. And that's the override system in your body. It makes you start to breathe. All right, so that CO2 causes a drop in blood pH. CO2 will dissolve in water and turn into a mild acid, and that drops the pH. Remember, the lower the number, the more acidic it is. And that triggers an increase in heart rate and depth of breathing. It'll just make you take a nice big breath and de-acidify your blood. Okay, blood transport, respiratory gases. The heart pumps oxygen, poor blood to the lungs, right? So you have to get it to the lungs to pick up the oxygen. It picks up the oxygen, drops off the carbon dioxide. Then the heart pumps the oxygen-rich blood to your entire body. Your whole body needs that. The whole rest of the body gets it. The oxygen gets dropped off, and then when it's dropping off the oxygen, it picks up the metabolic waste of CO2. Okay, so here's a diagram of that gas transport. You have right here, you have your heart, you have your oxygen poor blood. It needs oxygen. So that gets pumped up into the lungs where it's going to get oxygenated, nice rich oxygen. It's going to then take that oxygen-rich blood back to the heart. So it makes just a short trip to the lungs. Just boop, go to the lungs, get some oxygen, back to the heart. Then it gets pumped to the rest of the body, and where all this diffusion of oxygen to the cells and CO2 from the cells, and then it just goes around in a circle and does that. Okay, gases diffuse down a partial pressure gradient in the lungs and the tissue, so it goes from the areas of high pressure to the areas of lower pressure. Hemoglobin is the protein that carries oxygen and helps transport CO2, and it buffers the blood. So hemoglobin is found in your red blood cells. It's what makes them red. Transports oxygen, helps buffer the blood, and carries some CO2. Mostly it's really, really good at carrying oxygen. Okay. So how the CO2 works in the blood, remember I said it'll slightly acidify it. CO2 will dissolve in water and dissolve into carbonic acid. Carbonic acid can disassociate into hydrogen and bicarbonate. So it's a weak acid that kind of buffers it a little bit so it doesn't become real acidic, but that slight acidity of the carbonic acid is what triggers your breathing. And the human fetus exchanges gases with the mother's bloodstream. Obviously, they can't breathe. There's no, tube to the outside to get air in there. It all has to be through the mother's bloodstream. So the exchanges occur in the placenta with the maternal blood. So the maternal blood, the mother actually has to breathe something like 30% more gas exchange at the end of her pregnancy to oxygenate the baby's blood. And it goes through the placenta and then into the baby's blood. Now you ask, how does the baby get the oxygen from the mother? Why would it transfer from the mother to the baby? And that has to do with fetal hemoglobin. Okay. Fetal hemoglobin is actually stronger at holding oxygen than maternal hemoglobin, regular hemoglobin. Fetal hemoglobin will grab that oxygen right out of the mother's bloodstream and bring it to the baby. Then when the baby's born, it's not getting oxygen anymore, just like us. It's the same trigger. You get an increase in CO2 in the fetal blood, and that's going to stimulate that first breath.